April 1st, 1976. Apple incorporates. They are 40 years old. 40. Walt Mossberg did a video where he had all his old stuff. Pulled out all his old Apple
Walt's got a little museum in his office. Got all this stuff.
What is that, a 2CX, 2CI? It's a portable, the Apple Apple II portable. That's a luggable, really. Well, though smaller than a compact.
Right. Yeah, no monitor on the front.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. There's no monitor, so you have to lug that too. Oh, yeah, right. Any memories of 1976, you old timers?
Well, I was a mainframe jockey in 1976.
Really?
But I did get an Apple II in 1979, I think.
Wow.
And it was absolutely mind-boggling to have this machine that I could afford to buy, that I could actually carry around if I needed. I wasn't portable, but I moved from Massachusetts to California, and I put it in the back of my car, and I didn't need a moving van. And it was life-changing. I mean, it literally changed. In fact, it changed my career. I was getting a doctorate in education, which I actually wound up getting, and I haven't had a job in education ever because I was so excited about the Apple II that I wound up becoming a technology writer instead of a college professor. But it was just amazing. And to see how Apple was able to reinvent itself so many times and bring itself literally from the verge of extinction before Steve Jobs came back, I think it was in 1997, if I don't recall, and turned itself into a consumer electronics company, is really a remarkable story that will be remembered. I think as long as we remember businesses, this will be remembered as an amazing company.
Kind of fun. Regis McKenna, who was the genius PR guy who helped Apple get on the map, and not just Apple, Intel and many others get on the map, has released some of his notebooks from those early days. First revelation is that Regis McKenna apparently owned a rubber stamp that said, "Return to Regis McKenna himself." Which is a bizarre rubber stamp to make, but okay. And in these notebooks, fascinating stuff. I mean, I guess this was his MO. This is how he operated. And so he would take notes, copious notes. Here's a note from a meeting in 1972 with Intel. What is a microcomputer? How do you use it? Typical applications. He's helping them figure out how to create ads like this. How to use, this is 1973. What is a microcomputer? What does it do? How to use it? McKenna was an absolute genius, and hiring him was a brilliant, brilliant move. He met with Jobs when he was 21 in 1976. Woz was 25, took copious notes. Here's a letter from Regis dated June 22nd, 1976, just a couple of months after incorporation. I met with Steve Jobs at Apple last Thursday in his garage. And then Steve visited our office. He is 21. Along with a 25-year-old partner, Steve has designed, manufactured, and is marketing a microprocessor system, the Apple I computer. His first ad is attached. It will appear in Interface. Remember that? Interface magazine?
Yeah, absolutely.
In July. This is just great stuff. Really, this Fast Company had the article.
Yeah, Harry McCracken, I think, wrote that.
Of course, Harry probably kept all of this stuff.
Harry's the greatest.
Harry has become our archivist.
Yeah.
He's a walking museum in terms of his knowledge.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah. This is a great article. And thank you for reminding me that this is, I could give credit to Harry.
And by the way, that first Apple, I think my Apple II, when I finally got it decked out, I bought it with a cassette player at first because I wanted to save money. And then the next day I went and bought myself a floppy disk drive because it was obviously needed it. And then I had to buy a 80-column card because I wanted to use it for serious word processing. And I had to buy a card that allowed me to go uppercase and lowercase because the original Apple II was only uppercase letters. So by the time I fully decked out the machine to the point where it's actually usable, I'm going to want to say almost $3,000.
Yeah.
I think it was about $3,000 for the whole thing.
Which for a long time was the typical price of a computer you could actually
$2,500 was the number, right? The computer you want is $2,500. We used to say that. Now it's $200.
Yeah, really.
Or
and remember, this
$5,000.
This was $3,000, $1981.
Right.
I have to do the math.
That was money when it was real money. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Here's the first Apple ad that also appeared in Interface magazine with a typo in the very first line. The Apple I system, if a fully assembled, tested, and burned-in microprocessor, I think he meant is a fully a typo. And, of course, the famous price of the Apple One, $666.66, which Woz thought was a hysterical joke. And it includes, get this, 4 kilobytes of RAM. Wow. Wow. Nice stuff. And there's Ron Wayne's very famous, beautiful illustration of Sir Isaac Newton. It was too complicated to end up using as the Apple logo. It was the first Apple company logo. Ron Wayne only lasted 2 weeks before he said, "Oh, you guys are scaring me. I got to get out of here. You could get sued, and I'd be left with, as the only guy who has anything, I'd be left with nothing." I interviewed Ron Wayne on Triangulation a few months ago, and a great guy who never regretted bailing out of Apple, even though he'd be a multi-billionaire at this point. Really, I'm so. Did Harry go to Regis McKenna and say, "Can we copy your notebooks?" How did he get these? They're just great. And well worth reading. You can click on them to blow them up. Really a fun story.
Look at that picture. That's a great picture.
There's Regis and Steve in early 1980s. Really, really great stuff.
Really a contrast in styles, too, in that picture.
Well, yeah, Steve was a barefoot hippie.
That's right.
And
smelly barefoot hippie.
Smelly barefoot hippie, and Regis was a button-down guy. But I think Steve was aspired to be what Regis was, I think, and learned. One thing Steve Jobs was a sponge. He learned from everybody he was around. And I think he learned a lot from Regis because Steve became probably the best marketer of our time.
What was also amazing about Apple, and I have to say to some extent they've continued this tradition up through the iPhone and the iPad, is creating technology that's actually easy to use. I mean, the Apple II, compared to what preceded it, was so much easier to use than anything. Well, you could argue the Radio Shack Model 1 was comparable, but it really was a breakthrough time. And then, of course, the Macintosh, which came out in '84, was another breakthrough product. And the same could be said, I think, for the iPhone, when compared to a BlackBerry. So they've had a good track record. Whether they'll continue that at this point is anybody's guess.
Yeah, it feels like, maybe not, but it feels like they've reached kind of the end of the innovation line, and they're now more evolutionary. Certainly,
it feels that to me. I mean, given the fact that, okay, great, we now have a new 4-inch iPhone. That's the great innovation of 2016 so far.
and a shrunk down iPad Pro. Although I bought the iPad Pro, and the iPad Pro itself was too big for me. But the 9.7-inch iPad Pro, even with its little keyboard, is exactly what I wanted. I could carry it around with me in my backpack and have it at all times. And it's actually kind of an interesting, but it's purely evolutionary, if even that.
Yeah.
I don't think that Apple. Well, Apple stuff is probably simpler. Try to find a setting in Windows 10 versus OS 10. It's usually a little easier. But I think when you look at some of the things that they have done in the last 3 or 4 years with iOS, it is so much more complicated and things seem so much more random.
Yeah.
Hand an iPhone to somebody and tell them, how do you do this if they're not familiar with it? And at the early iPhones, you could figure it out pretty quickly, but you have a lot of puzzlement, I think, now. It's much more complex, and they haven't figured out, I think, how to mask that complexity with a simpler interface.
They made, I think, a little mistake in iOS. When the Apple or the Macintosh first came out, and by the way, if you're an Apple historian or Apple fan, tomorrow on Triangulation, Bill Atkinson will be in studio with us.
Oh, wow.
The guy who wrote the ROMs for the original Macintosh, invented QuickDraw, which was a brilliant bit of code, and Mac Paint and Mac Draw. But in those days, one of the things Apple did right was they had a very detailed, specific manual for programmers on the Apple user interface, and this is how it must be done. This is the right way to do it. And one of the things they had, one of the tenets that I really took to heart at the time, having read their interface guidelines, was something they called monotony. There should be one and only one way to do anything, because the human brain learns that pathway. You don't want multiple pathways. It's too confusing. That's why the one-button mouse for so long. There were a lot of things that Apple did right. When iOS came out, they didn't do the same user interface guidelines. And as a result, and I think this is really where the confusion lies, if you're using Apple stuff, you can kind of figure it out, but every app has a different UI. And there's no standard for how you do things. And trying to figure it out. The settings sometimes are in the app, sometimes they're in the settings for the phone itself.
Yeah. It's
all
funny you
over
say
the
that
place.
because I actually find Android in some ways easier to use, which is ironic, right? Because
Google
it does
has
have
some
a
much more strict,
consistency. Yeah.
yes, much more strict
Ironically,
UI
yeah.
guidelines.
Yeah.
I
I'm
also
an
think
Android
that-
fan, frankly.
I think Google's been more willing to rethink the operating system as well than Apple. Apple seems very, very tied to this idea that iOS is very simple. And so as it adds more and more comprehensive functionality, it just feels more and more tacked on. The notification system in iOS still bugs the hell out of me versus in Android, which is much more intuitive and much more easy to clear notifications out and to hide notifications that I don't want or disable them altogether. Things like that in iOS, it just still feels like it's glued on top of the original iOS, which was never meant to have notifications in the first place. I really think that it's time for iOS to be not quite a clean slate, but ultimately
Rethought,
being
yeah,
because ultimately it's doing a lot more than it was ever intended to do, and to keep adding on more functionality just feels more like a square peg getting driven harder and harder into a round hole.
To be fair, though, Android has had the benefit of watching Apple and then following on.
Right.
So, I would imagine that Andy Rubin and the Android guys are looking at the iPhone saying, these notifications, we need really better notifications. How could we do this right? And so they have when you're second, you have the option to kind of learn from mistakes made by the guy taking the arrows.
Well, it's funny listening to what Tim was saying about Apple needing to kind of reboot. It reminds me of what happened in 1997 when the Mac operating system was getting a little old, and they wound up acquiring Next and getting a lot. I wonder if there's somebody out there who can, another Steve Jobs out there in the wings who can give Apple what it needs for iOS.